Hey everybody, thanks for joining us live and for watching this later. I'm Mansour and I'm going to be covering the webcast today. We're going to be talking about how to evaluate cybersecurity solutions against ransomware. Basically answering the question, is my stuff good enough to block that latest cybersecurity threat I'm reading about on the news? We're going to cover a couple bullets here about how to choose the security solutions, how to accurately assess the outcomes they're supposed to drive, and whether those solutions are going to be able to keep up with the response times required to stop these attacks before they cause a lot of damage. It's also important to understand the outputs that your actionable intelligence is going to give you. What are you actually getting out of the product or the service, or how are you going to stop the attack itself? What does it take to get the job done? The agenda is pretty quick here. It's going to be an introduction to myself, a little bit about how we make decisions here at ActZero and how I've made decisions in the past about cybersecurity technology. We're going to talk about the disconnect in cybersecurity frameworks and what they mean relative real breaches that happen in the wild. We're also going to talk about measuring how you can stop an attack and the outcomes that you need to measure when you're under attack to know whether you're doing a good enough job. We're also going to talk about a method for assessing security solutions, some very key takeaways about how you assess a security solution instead of just saying, how many people use it and how much money do you have, right? And we're also going to help you prove it, right? What we're offering today is one of my favorite exercises to ever launch at ActZero, which is basically a red team test where we're going to go and evaluate your endpoint, probably the most important security software you can buy for you on your behalf, right? We're also going to leave behind some resources which are still going to be important even if you do get breached. There's still things that even if you detect and respond to an attack, you still have to do. Cybersecurity controls, understanding the differences between how to manage security product as well as, obviously the giveaway of the talk, which is to do the test. Some quick housekeeping for those of you who are watching and are going to participate live. We have 3 buttons at the bottom with Bright Talk. One is to obviously facilitate questions so that you guys can ask me anything near the end of the webinar. We also have an ability to provide feedback about the webinar, and of course, links to those resources that we're going to leave behind so you can get access to those at any time. So let's dive in. A little bit about myself. I have been purchasing testing software and security product and building security operations centers since 2005. Most people who know me as their virtual CISO as part of the service at ActZero enjoy asking me questions about product all the time. So I'll give you a bit of insight today, hopefully, as to how I evaluate those technologies to stay a little bit vendor neutral and actually focus on the outcomes and how you actually find and stop cyber attacks with the different product that you can buy. Before we get started, I want to make clear that this isn't going to be an evaluation matrix for every security project that you've ever had, everything from identity to privilege access management. Though I have an opinion and a framework for those as well, you are focusing today on the most critical component of your cybersecurity framework, which is your antivirus, and on the most prevalent operating system in the enterprise, Windows. So we're going to be talking about Windows Enterprise and how to block things on the endpoint. It's important to understand that we can assess any provider if you guys are interested in the offer. So please do bring us your greatest, your latest, your MSP managed, tier 1 next gen AV, and we'll show you how we would measure and continue to measure that as part of the ActZero service to make sure you're getting the right outcomes, which is blocking attacks. Important to remember, we have the free resources here and on our website as well, because we want to be present and be useful every chance we get. So provide us feedback, let us know if the resources are useful. And with that, we'll just jump right into how to evaluate the security product for your endpoint using frameworks versus real attacks, real breaches. When you go out there and you Google, how to get, what's the best antivirus, you might come across a couple of different resources. Usually they have evaluations, right? So if you go to avtest.org, or if you look at the MITRE eval attack, you're usually looking at a third-party organization that has, for whatever reason, decided there's ways to detect and respond to cybersecurity threats, and that they can evaluate different products for you so that who has the better value as a vendor. And it's important to understand what these tests are good for, right? They're going out and getting usually known malware, or they're testing things in the laboratory. In the case of AV test, they may have several samples that they just continually drop against different antivirus vendors and tell you what their block rate is, maybe features and capabilities that they compare. But largely it's just features and test malware, right? And if you look at something like MITRE, the attack evaluation, that kind of tries to categorize everything that happens in a cyber attack. As we all know, ransomware is more than just that file that encrypts stuff. It's the entire attack lifecycle that leads up to disabling your antivirus and running that program with admin credentials, right? So the concept of the kill chain, or all the steps it takes to get to that final step, is something that they also have ways of testing. And the way that those eval things work is that almost once a year they'll go out and they'll take a very popular advanced persistent threat group, right? Usually getting fun names that you might have all heard of, like Hive or Hafnium or DarkSide or Revil, usually something cool and comic book like. That they'll then test to say, okay, well, how would you have done against all the steps in that particular attack kill chain, antivirus vendor A or B, and you even have a chance to include an actual person managing the product, which usually increases the score significantly. So that's usually how those tests are structured. Previously seen malware simulated steps on the attack lifecycle against one of the more prevalent cyber attacks. And those are the numbers. When you start to look at the numbers about who's getting a 5 and who's getting a 10 and who's getting a 7, that's really what those numbers are. It's the percentage coverage of those different types of simulations in the A/B test capability, but also, against the adversary or one adversary in the MITRE attack kill chain. Why do I go to great lengths to tell you about these? Because these scores are almost always used by people who are shopping before they get an anti-malware product to attest whether or not this is a good security product. They may, call their friends and say, hey, you seem to know a lot about cybersecurity. How do you make a decision? Which antivirus would you use? And it's important to understand where the gaps are in these technologies, right? If every company has a life cycle, software development, all that other stuff, they may be good or bad at different times. How do you measure the success on an ongoing basis? And it's important to understand what these tests are lacking, right? The first is that they're not kept up to date, right? They're usually run annually, right? The evaluations tend to work with malware that's already been seen, or a single attack test looking at different stages of the attack. So it's not the 100% of all malware known in the wild, which most people will almost always assume when they see the number 100%. It's also important to understand that they get points for different reasons. When you look at the MITRE attack evaluation, you get points for every stage of the attack life cycle you've either labeled or blocked successfully. And that means that you can get more than 100. And if that means that you can get more than 100, then the way that people see those scores as percentages is also a fallacy, right? It's a mistake in the calculation. So the gap remains in these testing facilities about how frequent they are, that they're community driven. They decide which attack group, they decide which malware, they decide how often, and the detection and guidance about how to mitigate the threat that complements these things are not always there, right? They usually sort of mention the attack. They may not mention everything about the detection or link you to the product. And they, of course, don't even link you to controls that can avoid it. Like if you steal my credentials, here's multi-factor authentication to avoid that being a problem. But in the same breath, that's one that's very obvious. There's many that don't even exist. There's no mitigation to many of the attacks that are listed there. So to say all that is important because it comes back to, well, then how do you measure success? How am I supposed to know if without getting hacked, my stuff will actually block the latest attack group, right? And that's where we start to talk about the relevant ways to test your cybersecurity product, specifically on the endpoint. The first is to look at the block rate, right? Is to be able to take the attacker objectives, to take malware and understand what the current block rate is. What does it actually block by default? How does it block it, right? Are there significant gaps in the way that it's quarantining a machine and stopping the attacker? Or is it simply just quarantining the file like your Symantec or Sophos is of old, right? And if it does, that means that it may offer, even with a very good block rate of blocking every single file from running, an unlimited chances for the attacker to continue on the endpoint, right? Blocking a file from running doesn't necessarily mean you've quarantined the machine or broken the process or the credential that allows access to that machine in the first place. So you're giving the attacker 100 shots on net, right? As opposed to just containing them where they began. So block rate's important, but it's important to understand that not all objectives can be blocked 100%. It's very valuable to see not 100% as the goal, but enough that you can still use your machine as the outcome of the test, right? So when we think about things like going to the airport and swiping our passport, that's a Windows box, and it's been hardened within an inch of its life. but it's not a very usable Windows workstation for most people to get on Zoom every day like you are today and try to do your job, right? So the block rate is not going to be 100%. That's not the goal. It's as good or as close to blocking all of the different attack scenarios while still allowing the software we know and love to continue to run. The second thing that we have to measure is what we call the dwell time, right? There could be a lot of different arguments in the cybersecurity community about what this is. So I'll be very specific about this definition. How long is that attack persisting on the endpoint? When they actually choose to run the attack scenarios in sequence, scripted, how long are they allowed on that endpoint? Which is very different than breakout time, which is how long before they achieve objectives and go to the next endpoint. And that's a very critical time period because the breakout time depends on how many other systems they can affect in a single pass, right? So if they can dwell on one machine and go to multiple other machines, that's usually when you have a very serious problem. So we definitely don't want a high breakout time. We don't want a breakout time at all, actually. We want to make sure that we're blocking them when they're on the actual endpoint originally, right, in the dwell period. The last thing we want to measure is signal to noise, right? If you're in an emergency and I was to come at you and start yelling a bunch of information, right? Just screaming different things to do, changing my mind, just giving you nonstop updates, it would be very hard to focus on your job, which is countermeasures or some sort of other remediation that you need in a critical moment like this. And so dwell time is a very critical time period to sort of capture in terms of how long something persists to make sure it doesn't happen. But once it happens, what's the notifications you're going to get? Right? And that notification shouldn't be more than you need to determine how to act, right? Which is what we call the signal to noise ratio, right? How much information can we consume that gives us enough detail about how to respond that we don't miss anything, but we're also not inundated with a bunch of alerts that are confusing or cryptic or irrelevant or not collated or in any way just sort of, slowing us down, right? The ratio of how many actual attack, scenarios were run versus, how many, indicators did we actually get? How many notes or alerts did we get? How many things do we have to look at? So knowing that these three are the most critical things, right? It's important to understand what the elite SOC teams do to test this type of stuff. And I don't want to make it sound like it's a, super, qualified, educated person that's going to be able to do it. Elite SOC teams is usually the teams with the more money, right? If you look at, a Formula One car and a Honda, right? They're a bit different, right? Even if Honda's in Formula One. The idea is that they spend a lot of money on those, right? There's a whole entire team focused on every single aspect to cut weight and make sure that this is as operating as well as possible. That's an elite SOC team, usually one with a lot of money, usually at a large company, usually with a lot of dedicated roles, usually focusing on everything from the reactive to this part, which is the proactive, right? It's to make sure that on the days that you're not hacked, you have some way to simulate, continuously test, and move through different attacks. And I would argue that when you're trying to measure things like block rate, dwell time, and signal to noise, which I doubt even the most elite SOC teams, can get to that level where they're actually really starting to measure the signal to noise ratio, but it's very key for their teams, right? Because it starts to talk about labor savings, time savings, and therefore money savings for the team that make it more efficient in the SOC. The other bullets here are really about how often you should do this, right? If attacks change every 24 hours, your test should reflect that, right? If there's a new, quantum malware campaign, or there's a new, Felina, vulnerability that leads to a remote code execution campaign, those are all things that, may appear 1 or 2 weeks from this webinar. And there's going to be another one in another couple of days, right? So if it's every 24 hours on average, these things change on the dark web, it's important to make sure that your breach and simulations are executed on those specifics as often as every 24 hours, right? To keep pace, right? The other thing is that most teams don't have the ability to test real malware. They don't know if their product is lighting up because the simulation is accurate, and therefore it can trick the machine learning or the signature detection or behavior detection inside their product that sends off those alarms. Instead, they can't really bother with real world malware because they don't have a sandbox, or frankly, they don't have access to it because they don't connect to the dark web to download those types of things. But it's very important to make sure you're testing with the real stuff and variants of it, as well as the simulation. So I know a lot of you are probably going to say, is that even practical advice? It is if you want to make sure that the attack is not going to be successful, right? Because that's a part of the fallacy of assuming you're protected just because a simulation works. So real and simulations combined. The dark web is a great place to get this information, not honeypots, right? honeypots, you're trying to trick some botnet or person into, exploiting something. You see a lot of vendors, intrusion deception vendors, and, people talking about how many honeypot servers they have all over the world, tracking and analyzing attacker behavior. That's not really that great, right? Because, depending on how far they got in those honeypots, they may not be revealing all their secrets, right? Instead, it's better to leverage the dark web, which is, as an attack team, if you were an e-crime actor, where you go to get this stuff, right? You don't just go to Walmart and buy, the latest version of malware, right? Though there might be some embedded in the USB key on the shelf. You go to the dark web, where the attack teams go to buy ransomware as a service, and that's where you should be sourcing a lot of your material, right? The other thing is, you should be covering defense in depth. I know the focus of this webinar is on endpoint malware, but your network and your cloud, they may not be running antivirus directly on them, right? They run a very different pattern recognition, deep packet inspection, unified threat management, next generation firewalling, whatever you want to call it, that is supposed to detect and block attacks in transit, right? And so we want to make sure we understand, as part of a larger evaluation, when you're doing this for real, whether or not those have a significant play on your protections, as well as, how would your cloud do against cloud-specific attacks, account takeovers, malicious admin activity, that type of stuff, because we're all in the cloud now, likely. The final point here is that you probably shouldn't buy this if you're not prepared to use it, right? You try to buy simulation software or try to set one of these labs up, the problem is going to be that you likely don't have a full-time resource or resources that are going to dedicate themselves to doing this full time, which means either you're going to be later than every 24 hours, you're not going to have the realistic, evaluations to make the product worth it or the setup worth it, or, frankly, the values that you're saving, you're not able to tune and tweak to make sure that you can add more and more and more. So this should all be a function of your efficiency. And if you're not going to be efficient at the testing and improvements, you're probably not going to get the value out of this at all, right? So either, buy it as part of a service like ours, or, I'd say, make sure you can dedicate the time if you have one of those more expensive teams. Now, I'm going to stress this again. I know that we talked about the dark web. It's very important to, understand more than, it's onion routing and encrypted messaging and, this sort of underbelly of the internet, right? It's about how attackers organize themselves online. It is the source of how they share malware, how they share credentials, how they share, information about you, right? It's places that are hard to shut down with the governments and regulation and the extraterritorial capabilities that law enforcement has, right? So a lot of these sources are things that will continue to persist. You smash one down like Silk Road, and others pop up like Telegram. So you got to keep going to newer places to make sure that you're in lockstep with where this stuff is. But that's where you go to get the latest and greatest wares, right? That also makes sure that you are testing. You want to be able to collect this stuff often, so that you are aware often, so that you can test relative how far the attacker community actually is, or at least the stuff that they're sharing, right? It's also important to understand how your vendor's capabilities line up against that stuff, right? It's not just about going and collecting from the dark web. The reason you're downloading those relevant samples is to make sure that your vendor can find and block that kind of stuff. And if you don't have a tool that can integrate those two things, the malware that you got and whether your vendor can find and stop it, you're doing all the heavy lifting for connecting those two things left to right, right? Lastly, there's information about the way that you want to automate this process to speed it up, that we talk about the vendor lining up with that. So it's got to be automated, it's got to be fast, it's got to be executed in less than 24 hours. And then of course you want to measure the outcomes, again, not just the block rate, but you want to talk about independent prevention, not having to know, oh, I use checkpoints AV, or I use Traps or Cyvera or Cortex XDR or whatever it's called from Palo Alto now. You want to do independent of that, because if you're shopping for this, it's very valuable insight at the time you're buying something. It's also very valuable insight months and months later, because it's still a problem later, right? So let's talk about it. Let's go through a quick demonstration here and just look at a few of the ways that you can dig through this information for yourself. So like I talk about A/B test a little bit. If you've never seen this website before, you have a whole bunch of different rankings up here for different antivirus protection for home and for business that are done by malware samples, right? And so you obviously heard me knock this a little bit in the early part of the presentation, but the concept is that this is what I was talking about. Similarly, if you go to MITRE Ingenuity and your vendor, your AV vendor or MDR vendor or some other vendor is sending you their latest attack scores, it's good to be able to understand the URL that allows you to see the latest attacks. So like I talked about, they pick one attack group, they go through a number of those different attack steps. They decide, hey, with an MSP, your score could be this. Without an MSP, your score could be this. And you see that the numbers are, even though advertised by many of the vendors as we blocked 100% of, and they find some area that they did, maybe okay on, you really do have to understand that these are just labels that they're giving to the different attack stages, and that this is not the whole way that you should, evaluate, the product, because it's a year old, it's one attack scenario, and these are just counts of how they map to MITRE, right? So you're not looking at 100% there. So what would you do, right? What are we offering as part of this webinar? What would we do to evaluate this, right? We've partnered with a company called Picus. I call it Picus because I can't pronounce it properly. But the idea is that this is a company that has built breach simulation and attack detection software that we use for our proof of concept. And the concept here is that they will download regularly through the dark web, roughly every few days, information about the variants and the actual malware, ransomware, and other types of malicious code that can be used to exploit a lot of these things. When you're reading the news and you're looking at templates for vulnerabilities, right? Oh, I have Confluence and I'm worried there's a 0-day that they're going to break in and remote code execute. Oh, there's this Felina MSDT compatibility troubleshooter vulnerability that's going to allow them remote code execution. And Log4j and DarkSide and down the ways you go. It's important to understand that there are real ways that those can be tested. They're real versions of those pieces of malware that you can download from the dark web. And then there are also, the endpoint simulations that can walk you through specifically, something like the quantum ransomware campaign, all the different attack stages that they use to, inject you through LSAS and then drop their ransomware once that injected execution happens, right? So very inside baseball about how that attack works, but very relevant because we can safely test those attack scenarios, get real results from the actual endpoint as to whether it blocked it or not, and then use that as a way to say, well, what are the compensating controls and what are the detections and response rates that we see, right? So when you look at, as part of our resources, what we're offering here, there's a few ways that we run the scenario. We download the agent for you. You can bring any one of your agents, server, workstation, whatever config you have. You're with your MSP standing by. And we run the test and show you basically what those percentages are. We then compile a very simple report about how ready you are for a breach like this, right? And the concept is that we cover a few things. The first is, how'd you actually do relative to the ActZero agent, right? How'd you do relative us going and running these tests continuously and modifying our policies constantly to stay ahead of these types of attacks versus something you've likely set and forgot or your MSP is waiting to make a noise from with the current configuration, right? And so that you get real hard numbers out of this assessment, right? The first is, what is the percentage block rate against the top 73 different attacks? This could be very famous attacks, newsworthy attacks that you hear about all the time. Everything from Quantum to Revol to the SolarWinds attack, Blackbite ransomware, Conti ransomware, all those big names that you hear about on your Google alerts, right? And the concept here is that when you run it against the 75 simulations, there may be hundreds of different attack objectives that are like MITRE, different attack scenarios like downloading a file or executing credential theft or injecting something. And so it's important to know how you would have done to block the actual campaign. Then it's important to understand when the native block rate is there, that's all well and good. How long did it take to do that? Were you able to actually contain the attacker within minutes before the average of dwell time and breakout time, which measured by our partner CrowdStrike is 1 hour and 38 minutes before they get to another machine? So obviously getting near the red would be pretty bad, right? Because then the malware doesn't exist on just one endpoint anymore. It started on a new one, so who cares what it did to the last one? That endpoint's now ransomware, right? So the concept here of what's the block rate, what's the dwell time going to be very valuable. And then what's the signal to noise ratio? If you run these types of attacks, there may be, for example, if you look at our percentage block rates, the number of objectives that ran and the numbers that didn't, right? So there may be 500 things that ran. To find those in your SIM, your EDR, or the data repository is going to be very difficult. So how much was the compression between the alerts you were sent that explain this in plain English versus what actually happened, right? And this is where you start to see how we, spent a lot of time in the data science team compressing that ratio, right? So if you have thousands of attacks that can be sitting inside of your raw data like a SIM, how many security events may be bonded to those that require an investigation versus what you get in an incident that should explain in plain English, what specifically happened. Collating and bringing together a lot of these different aspects of the attack so that in its heart what it was, what workstation and user did what on what system, right? And then where was it blocked, where did it go? So compressing that type of information together is another thing that we evaluate within the test to make sure that everybody understands just how much noise they'd see when one of these things are actually going on, because that really affects beyond the dwell time when you actually have to say, okay, we now know the attacker's there. You've now got an incident response time, right? You probably got 15 minutes after this number to go and try to contain the threat. And that's where cybersecurity incident response really is. So I'm going to turn back to the presentation, if I can end my screen share without going into the thing there. That was the prove it section, is to say, well, how would you do it? So that's how we would prove it for you. And the concept is that there are key points to how that proof is done that we believe makes it stand up a little bit better than an older, more single use case type of test, right? The first is that relevant attack techniques are used. So the ones that are actually hitting people now, today, the quantum tomorrow, the MSDT, the day after that, a new nation state sponsored Russia-Ukraine conflict, RCE that we see, these are all things that are going to hit us, right? And as we become aware of them, we should very quickly be able to test, very quickly modify our policy, and very quickly offer advice on what's left to do. That's where the words threat hunting come from, is hunting for the things that the product cannot block by default to see if they've impacted you, right? It also speaks to the fact that we have virtual CISO, right? So the concept is these tests should be able to calculate all of those things. So relevant attacks, as comprehensively as possible, running in different orders, because you can't measure dwell time if you only run it in one order. It's got to be an average, right? And those averages help you calculate exactly what that block rate and what those dwell times actually are, right? You also have to be focused on the fact that this is a trifecta, right? The block rate's great, but only if it stops it in time, and it only stops it in time valuably if the information given to a qualified person is collated in a way that makes it very simple to understand, right? Otherwise, you do not have dwell time. You have longer dwell time because you've now extended your incident response time, right? Because all that signal that wasn't compiled by the system is now lost, right? It's somewhere in a SIM or something like that, which wastes a whole bunch of energy. 3, you want to be able to do multiple things. If you just kill a process, that's not enough, right? You need to be able to delete backing files. You need to be able to quarantine machines. And I don't mean the quarantine is a word I wish they used, like a network quarantine or something more broad to describe this at large, because quarantining the endpoint means nobody can use it, right? Not for the period of time that you're doing the investigation. So it's locked up. And that lockup is a way that prevents the attacker from trying more things, running more scripts, using command and control, because they're not going to be sitting on hands and keys very likely at your desk, right? They're going to be somewhere where they can't be prosecuted running this stuff remotely. So having that quarantine capability, very key. Some products don't have it. Some products don't automatically apply it. Some products can't stack different things, which brings us to the last point, which is that you also have to evaluate why something blocked it, right? Did it block it because it had a signature for it and this is old hat? Or did it block it because it could dynamically adapt with something like machine learning? In our studies, what we find is, roughly 30 or 40% of the block rates assigned to machine learning that adapt to these changes that the attackers are doing on the dark web to create variants of their ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service, of course, get as many ransomware files as you want until it works, right? So how do we keep making sure that all those different files don't work? You adapt to it with something like machine learning. So why did it block it? How did it block it? As important as, the fact that it at some point was mitigated, right? Because that'll also tell you how many variants would happen over time. So back to the breach assessment, what we're pitching in this webinar, really, it's quick and easy. It takes about an hour to run. Most people are like, really? Yeah, really, about an hour to run. You measure these 3 things. We talk about other things on the call, in the report, such as dark web monitoring. We'll also do a quick maturity assessment for you that explains whether you would have had compensating controls, because a lot of people like to look at those numbers and go, yeah, but that wouldn't matter because I'm doing A, B, or C. Well, are those A, B, and C compensating controls actually best practice, or are those thoughts that the admin had that may work in certain scenarios and honestly may not in many scenarios, right? So good to understand that context when we're doing these assessments, because again, the block rate is not going to come at 100% and be like super good. That's how you do it. The other things are going to play in. How vulnerable are you? how much dark web presence do you already have about things they're trying to position against you, and then of course how are your controls to compensate for something like this happening. So the resources here, take a look at the sample, see if this is a thing you want to be able to do if you're shopping for an MDR service. Understanding that after this happens, after you get the notification, after all this goodness goes into detecting and responding to a threat, now comes the incident response. Now comes the actual procedural inspection of things and countermeasures, remediation, and all kinds of other third-party notifications that go into everything from notifying a privacy office to your legal counsel, cyber insurer, and everybody else. So very helpful to download our Foundations of Incident Response Readiness, because after you do something like this is when you'd want to work on your IR, those times. Lastly, MDR versus MSP, right? What are you doing behind the technology to improve those numbers? If you go to that MITRE attack eval stage, you see the trigger on the MSP button, and you always see the numbers go up, right? So I'm not going to take anything from MSPs, but that's basically what they're saying, is if they're looking at the technology aggressively and focused on it, they may have ways of manually introducing fixes, but they usually do that when something actually happens, instead of testing and constantly working on these priorities like an MDR that builds that into the service as managed detection and response with data science teams, security engineering teams, who are tooling this constantly. We are going to turn it over now to Q&A. If you guys have questions live, please feel free to ask, and I will try to answer as best I can. I see some stuff, but I'm waiting for the actual questions to show up here. So one of the first questions is, so why wouldn't I be able to run red team software myself, BSAD software? BSAD is breach simulation and attack detection software yourself. You certainly can. I prefaced it with elite SOC teams do this. And so when you think about a very large, very expensive elite SOC team, there is a benefit to a dedicated threat researcher on staff that will actually leverage tools like Vicus to go and download relevant versions of malware, simulations, run scenarios, blind, double blind, off hours, on hours, and try to measure through what we might call tabletops or assessments or pen tests, red team tests, those types of evals. So that's what you would do. I'd say that that's not right for most people, right? Just like I don't believe not everybody can build their own car, right? There are teams that just aren't equipped to deal with this problem full time, not because of the time, money, and resources that are required to do that. So they definitely don't benefit in many cases. And this is where maybe somebody like an MDR can maybe prove it to you and show you that we're using tools like that and others to actually make sure that our service is, maintaining a good result. One of the questions is, aren't the ActZero results the same as Falcon results? Falcon is the name of the CrowdStrike anti-malware product. So when you buy Falcon Prevent, that is the AV. And if you look at the block rates, right, you're going to say, well, if I ran CrowdStrike with you guys or with them, if you guys are using that engine, what's the difference? And the difference is that you can configure CrowdStrike like anybody to block absolutely everything on your workstation. And you can test it with red team software to make sure that its configuration, indicators of attack, the threat hunting through the EDR is all something that you want to be able to do yourself, right? That's all the things and more that you'd have to do in order to validate and get the same policies out of it. So just because you have the same knife doesn't mean you have the same capability as a chef. The numbers are going to be different when you run it out of the box or with your configuration, depending on how manned and how many customizations you put into the service, right? And that's a valuable thing to note, is that most AV vendors now come with an MSP or come with an MDR vendor behind them, right? And the value to that MDR and MSP is something that almost everyone measures, like MITRE Ingenuity. So you can see what the trigger is for continuous management versus not. In the 10 to 20% increase in the preventions, right? So that's what you should look for from any vendor that's running a tool to do it versus a service like an MDR service like ours, right? So that's the question about Falcon. I'm trying to just wait for the other ones to come in. One of the questions, what is AV test measuring if not blocking malware? It's important to understand that you block viruses, malware, which is scripts, executables, things that try to run exploits or other things like that on your operating system, right? And that's what malware is, right? And there's also the idea that I have an administrative password and I'm using PowerShell to just go through low-level, fairly what might seem benign in your logs or in the EDR, or not enough to block on your AV by default. Actions, right? And that's over half of the attack lifecycle is those types of actions, right? Zero-day exploits that may not have, logs or data or even an involvement on the endpoint you're talking about. It may be a SaaS app they broke into, right? And then there's other exploits that they run after the fact. So they might be measuring known, recorded virus total like the databases of malware samples that have been submitted to them through vendors or the open source community, and they might be using something like that. I can't speak to everything that goes into the methodology of their test. There are business requirements, feature requirements, simplicity, ease of use that go into some of their metrics. But by and large, you can see what their testing schedule is because they published it based on that time frame, and they'll probably give you some indication on their website in the FAQ as to what they're doing. But it's likely going to be that. Are the attacks real or not? Or what does simulation mean? So simulated attacks are the ones where you would run maybe multiple different stages of the attack, maybe even in the same way, that don't have material damage on the endpoint, I guess is the best way to put it. So when we talk about a simulation, it's enough to make sure that the real thing happened without actually maybe encrypting the operating system. So a simulation might be, I create a file called dummy.txt and I encrypt it. That's a simulation, as opposed to I use the actual live malware to encrypt the whole operating system indiscriminately by folder, and then I've said I've got the same thing, right? So one is the software as designed by the attacker executing the full functionality, and the other one is the method the attacker used without full destruction of the endpoint, right? And both should validate and should run and trigger your anti-malware, or prevention service notification if it's calibrated properly, right? If it's a good simulation. If it's a poor one, then maybe a lot of people would get away with saying that's not a realistic test, right? We have, I think, time for one more here. Why can't I do this myself is very close to, I think, the first question, which is, can I run this myself? So every team and every service and every software can be built and run by, another group of people. It is the maturity, the cost, and complexity of using that service that applies to different people at different times, right? So if you're a small to medium company, we believe ActZero is right for you, right? If you're a large enterprise with a large budget, and you've got the internal IT security teams that do nothing but this every single day and they do it efficiently, great. I would argue that even those teams should, knock on the door and eval with us just to see if they are getting what they believe they're getting from their existing service. Lastly, I will make sure that I mention it one last time. Just please remember that we do have the offer to do these breach assessments for you. Please, feel free to contact us at the landing information that we provided, ActZero.ai, breach/breach-assessment to request one of those today. And we'll hope to see more of you. Thanks so much for joining, and check us out online.